Thank you, Robert Dohner, for joining us. You are the former U.S. Treasury Deputy Assistant Secretary for Asia, and you spent 20 years at the Treasury Department where you were actually negotiating macroeconomic and financial sector reform openings with the Chinese government. China's economic model continues to be a pressing issue in trade negotiations. So just how much improvement have you seen in China's reform and opening?
So there have been big changes over the years, and China is a lot different than it was when I started. I think the thing that concerns people in the United States now, particularly in the policy community, is that China is in part turning back from the economic reforms and increased marketization of the past towards more state control of economic sectors and a greater importance of the state-owned enterprise sector.
Do you think that these trade negotiations can reverse some of those trends back to where you think they were before?
No, but I think the recent shift in the emphasis of Chinese policy is something that enters the trade negotiations and particularly influences the U.S. view of China. There are real issues that we face. They're difficult issues, and in a sense, the issues are about industrial policy, about subsidization of domestic industries, but also about the range of practices to acquire technology.
And talk to me about the context of these trade negotiations. Why do you see them as being so difficult, and are you optimistic that we're at least moving in the right direction towards a deal?
Okay. So the reason that they're difficult is that there really aren't international rules on industrial policy, on subsidization of domestic industry, and on the range of practices for acquiring new technologies. And in a situation in which there aren't rules, it's hard to get the country that you're complaining about, in this case the U.S. complaining about China, to agree to limits in exchange for some agreement on acceptable policy. So that's I think what makes the discussions, the negotiations so difficult.
And what would you advise the U.S. negotiators to do differently?
So I think the way to reach a solution or the way to reach an agreement on these issues is to really back away from the extreme positions on both sides. I think the United States needs to acknowledge that China has a legitimate right to develop technology domestically, to move up the value chain and to raise domestic incomes. And I think China needs to acknowledge that there are certain practices in subsidization, in acquisition of technologies that are unfair and illegitimate and ought to be ruled out. But that still leaves a substantial room of policies that both sides, I think, can agree to be acceptable.
And we're seeing recent data on China from industrial output and investment showing signs of weakness in the economy. So how much of that are you attributing to the trade war, and are China's stimulus measures enough to offset that?
So initially, it was almost entirely Chinese attempts to deal with excess debt in the financial system, the process of deleveraging in the Chinese economy. I think there's more effect from the trade conflict now, largely through uncertainty about how it's going to end up, where the profitable areas for investment are. And that's not just in China, that's worldwide.
And China, of course, also has this rapidly aging population, labor force is shrinking. Does that, coupled with the current economic picture you were just talking about, mean there's more of a chance it'll hit that middle income trap, not reach the high income level status?
I think that's indicative of the problems that China faces, and I think the leadership is quite aware of that. To get beyond the middle income trap, you really have to move up to a new set of industries, to higher value added, higher productivity, higher income industries. That's been difficult for many countries. I put the chances that China succeeds as quite high.
Even despite some of the curves we're seeing in technology exports, the backlash against Huawei, you think they can still reach that?
I think so, yes.
And despite the interconnectedness of the U.S. and Chinese economies, many are arguing that this is just the beginning of a global decoupling. Do you agree with that, and do you see a clear path to reverse that trend?
So we've gone through a period of increased integration of global economies, and particularly the development of international value chains where final goods were produced in stages in a bunch of countries. I think that probably has peaked and maybe gone too far, so that there's a pullback generally because of the risks of natural disasters like the tsunami in Japan. But it's also been affected by the trade conflict and the desire in the United States, I think, to have a U.S. economy that's less dependent on China.
You were also formerly the Treasury's representative in Japan, and we've been following the dispute right now between Japan and South Korea very closely, which could impact all sorts of production from iPhones to laptops. How do you see this impacting the U.S. and China?
So the U.S. position has always been that it's important for Japan and Korea to reach amicable agreements on the issues that divide them and to work together with the United States on major global issues. I think we no longer work for the government. The U.S. government has been very careful not to take positions or to weigh in on particular sides.
And Trump has called China being a currency manipulator as one of his key economic strategies, but evidence of that has been thin given Beijing's emphasis on financial stability. So what do you see as the future direction of the RMB?
So I think China has a strong interest in avoiding capital flight and avoiding a depreciation of the renminbi that creates the expectation of further depreciation and the movement of capital out of the country. So I think it's very unlikely that China would weaponize the exchange rate in the context of a trade conflict. I mean, the renminbi exchange rate will go up and down with a lot of things, including the state of the negotiations between China and the United States. I think that's normal.
And lastly, we've just heard from Jerome Powell that manufacturing, trade, and investment are all weak around the world, weighed down by some of these trade issues. Do you see that weakness spreading to the United States, which thus far has remained relatively strong?
So the United States has had the benefit of a huge stimulus from fiscal policy, from tax policy, from expenditure policy at a time that's very late in the cycle, and that's pushing activity in a lot of areas in the United States. So far, U.S. manufacturing has been relatively strong, although there are signs that that's slowing as well. So the U.S. is not immune from all of these things.